In this video, we will be guiding you through the step-by-step procedure for troubleshooting a DE-1008.5 Dohrect Enject System. Troubleshooting is essentially a series of questions followed by answers, and then if needed, an action is taken. So the first challenge we're going to look at is the pump does not pump. And with that, our first question will be, does your motor run? If your answer to that is no, we have to make sure that we address that first before we can look at why the pump may not be pumping. So in the video description below, we will place a timestamp for where we start troubleshooting the motor not running. For those of you where the motor runs and it's not pumping, we'll just continue on and work through that process step by step. Next, we have to look at the pumping tube and determine when was that replaced last. The pumping tube is a wear part that is recommended to be replaced annually. It is located inside of the pump enclosure. We recommend that it's replaced at least annually, and for a lot of operators that are doing higher volumes, it may have to be replaced more often than that. And as you see, if the pumping tube has been in place for a while, what happens is the tube ends up becoming kind of squished and will retain a memory that way, and it does not allow the pump to get enough volume, or in some cases just simply not pump. If you do need to change your pumping tube, we have a video for that as well. We're going to put the link for that video in the description below. So simply find that, click on that, and you can watch that video for the step-by-step process on how to change your pumping tube. If you've recently replaced your pumping tube and you know that's not the issue, this may seem simple, but the next thing we want to find out is there product in the cooler? Believe it or not, we've taken several calls from people with this challenge that simply had an empty cooler. So we want to open it up, take a look inside, and make sure that there's product in there. And then the other thing we want to take a look at is this valve. We want to make sure that the handle on the valve is pointing down. That indicates that it's drawing from the cooler. If we have the valve handle either pointing out towards you, that will be a shutoff position, or up would be for your flush bottle. So we want to make sure that we're trying to draw from the fluid that's in the cooler. So let's make sure that that valve is pointed down. Next, we want to start taking a look for any potential areas that might be plugged. So to do that, we're going to go through the system and check connection by connection. So the first place we're going to want to look at is right down in this valve assembly. We want to make sure that we have product flowing freely from inside the cooler to the outside of the cooler through the valve assembly. The easiest way to check this is by simply disconnecting this hose and then taking the valve handle and flipping that down. And if everything goes right, you should have product coming through there. If you don't have product running out of the cooler at that point, then we're going to want to take the cooler off or open the lid and take a look inside and make sure that the filter inside the cooler is clean. If you've cleaned the filter screen that's inside of the cooler and you still do not have product flowing freely from inside of the cooler to the outside, then we're going to have to look at a potential plug somewhere within this valve assembly. So in order to clean that up and eliminate that potential plug, what we'll need to do is disassemble this entire valve assembly, clean up each fitting, reassemble them, and then verify that we have product flowing freely from inside of the cooler to the outside of the cooler. Now that we've verified product is flowing freely from the cooler, if your system is still not pumping, we have to start working our way down the line from connection to connection. So we're going to move from the cooler. Our first stop on the way is this connection at the bottom of the pump enclosure. That happens to be the enclosure that the pumping tube is connected to. So we're going to open these 2/4 turn latches to open up the door. Now when we do this test, we want to make sure that the fluid level in the cooler is about to the top of the pump unit, because we need to inspect to find out if we've got free flow going through these fittings. So fluid's going to kind of find its own level, so we need to make sure we've got enough in there at least above this connection point. And we're going to want to start with the valve handle off, so that will be facing out towards you. So what we're going to do is open up the pump, and then we're going to disconnect this connection. That is the output connection, which is on the left side when looking at the pump enclosure. Swing the tube out and then flip the valve down. By doing that, you can see that product is flowing freely from this connection. So once we know we have product flowing freely there, we know that this is not plugged. If product does not come out of here, we need to make sure that we don't have a plug at that connection. Through the magic of video editing, we now have our flow meter and our applicator controller included in our setup here. In our last step, we found out and verified that we do have product flowing through the input connection to the pump. So the next step is going to the next connection. We're going to follow that pumping tube around, and we will see that it connects to the output of the pump unit. That's going to be the fitting on the left as you look inside the enclosure. So what we're going to want to do now is from that connection, we're going to follow that around to the next connection. That hose will connect to the input of your flow meter. The input of the flow meter is the connection on the back bottom. It's a simple compression nut, so you'll simply just turn that loose and disconnect that from the applicator. Now there's two different ways that we can check for product flow here. If you still have enough product in your cooler from the last test, what you can simply do is make sure the valve is down and then open up the head of the pump, and that will allow product to free flow. So with that flowing freely, we know that we do have a clear flow path through that fitting. The other option, if the pump is closed, such as this, or your product level is lower in the cooler, is to go up into your cab, turn the applicator on, and now we'll see that we have product flowing clearly from that connection. If you do find that one of those connections are plugged, we offer a brush set. It's got a custom brush in it. One brush is designed for cleaning the flow meter out, and the other brush is actually specifically designed for cleaning those fittings out. The part number is in the bottom of the video here, so you can take a look at that. For units that have been produced prior to 2019, these fittings actually had a check valve in them. And if the systems were not flushed out often enough, those check valves had a tendency to plug up. So those check valves can either be removed, and we have a video for that as well. A link to that video will be in the description at the bottom of this video. Or if you choose, you can replace them with a new part that does not have the check valve in it, and that part number is currently at the bottom of this video. Now that we know we have product flowing to the flow meter, the next step we have to take a look at is, are we getting product actually through the flow meter? So our next step, we will want to take the connection that is the output of the flow meter, which is the fitting on the top of the flow meter, which has the simple compression fitting on the back of it just as the input. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to loosen up that nut, and then we will disconnect that from the top of the flow meter. And in this case, we're going to want to turn the applicator on in order to make sure that we're pumping through and getting product through that flow meter. So as we turn the applicator on, what we should see is a nice steady stream of product coming out of the back of the flow meter, and that's going to indicate that our flow meter is not plugged up and we're getting product flowing clear through the flow meter. Okay, now we know we have product going from the cooler through the pump, through the flow meter. We've banged out the majority of it. The last spot that we have left would be the check valve that's on the end of the hose at your distribution point. Now keep in mind, this wasn't added to these systems until 2017. So this is something that has a function but isn't needed to be in the system. So it could be removed if necessary. But at this point, if you turn the applicator on and we're unable to get product out of the discharge location, then it really leads us to this check valve being plugged up. So what we want to see is we want to turn the applicator on, and we want to see a nice flow of product coming out of the discharge. So now we know we've got product coming from the cooler through the entire system. Your pumping tube is good, everything's running. So whatever challenge you had that might have stopped your system from pumping, we should have that all taken care of at this point. Now, occasionally we do get people that will tell us their system isn't pumping, but in all reality it is. They're getting product all the way through the system and flow is coming out of the discharge point. So in that case, a lot of times what we find is that the flow meter, the ball at the bottom of the flow meter is stuck to the spring. What generally causes that is the system is simply not getting flushed often enough or cleaned up well enough. Now, inoculants contain bacteria that when they start to die off in solution do get kind of slimy. In addition to that, the majority of the inoculants on the market have some form of a sugar in there as a food source for the bacteria while they're in solution. And sugar water, as you can imagine, also gets sticky. So what'll happen is if it's not flushed often enough, that ball will stick to the spring because those bacteria and those sugars actually kind of start to act as a glue, binding those two parts together. And the only way to really solve that is going to be to take the flow meter off of your harvester and to disassemble it. So the good news there is we already have a video that's available with step-by-step instructions on how to clean that up as well. So just like the other ones we have mentioned, we will put a link below in the description that will take you to how to clean that flow meter up and get that flowing freely as well. Now, admittedly, this video might be a little backwards because obviously you have to make sure that your pump is running before you can worry about it actually pumping. But more often than not, with troubleshooting these systems, we take calls with regards to pumping. So we wanted to address that on the first half. So if you are in a situation where your motor does not run, we will have to work through that and then go back to the beginning of the video in the event your system is not pumping after we get everything up and running. So the first thing that we're going to want to take a look at is we're going to want to make sure that the red light on the controller turns on. So with power to your controller, we want to turn that switch on. And if we see that red light, that gives us an indication that we have power to the controller is wired correctly, and that it's hooked up to a 12-volt system. In the event any of those things are not correct, that red LED light is not going to turn on. If you go into the cab and you turn the switch on your control, and the LED light does not turn on, what that is going to indicate to us that there is something wrong with either the power supply that's providing power to the controller, or there potentially could be something wrong with the controller itself. So what we need to first find out is our power supply appropriate to properly power the controller and in turn the applicator. So what we're going to do is we need to make sure that one, we do have power and a proper ground going to the controller. Two, we need to make sure that it's a 12-volt system. So essentially we need to be kind of between 8, 9, 10 volts on the low side up to about 15 on the high side, depending on whether we're dealing with alternating power or not. And then we also need to make sure that it's wired correctly. And what I mean by that is we need to make sure that the power and the ground wires are both connected to the appropriate terminals in their power supply. If those are wired backwards, that is what's called reverse polarity. Our controller has a reverse polarity protection in it, which would automatically shut the unit down and not allow power to pass through. And what that is for is essentially to protect the unit from going bad, because otherwise if it would be wired improperly, you could fry the controller. Now that we know the LED on the controller is not turning on, we have to take a look at why. That is generally one of two reasons. One is that we simply don't have good power or ground going to the control, or the other is the power supply connections could be backwards, which is known as reverse polarity. And we'll be checking for that later on. But first we have to determine if the problem lies within the controller or the power supply. And to do that, we're going to bypass the control. Now, depending upon which model you have, you're either going to have 2 or 3 different connections on the back of the controller. The older SP2 control will only have 2 connections, whereas the SP2L will have 3. We're only going to worry about 2 of those connections. The one connection that we're going to unhook will be the red and the black, which is the power in from your power supply, and the other is going to be the blue and the orange, which is the output to the applicator pump. So to do this, we simply unplug these connections from the controller. And what you will find is that these connections are actually a mated pair. So these fittings can simply plug into one another. Now if you plug them in together and the motor runs, what that indicates to us is that we have a good power and ground through the line. Now there is a chance that the controller could have shut down due to reverse polarity, and we will check that a little further in the video. But if you find out that your wiring is not hooked up backwards for reverse polarity, then that determines that the issue lies within the controller. So at that point, what we're going to need you to do is either send that controller into us and we can have that repaired, or you can order a control and just simply replace it. Now that we've bypassed the controller and the motor is running, we need to take a look to make sure that the motor is turning in the correct direction. Because what this is going to indicate for us is if the motor is turning the wrong way, then we know that the wires on the power supply are hooked up backwards, positive to ground and ground to positive. Again, if those are hooked up backwards, the controller is going to go into a shutdown mode to protect itself and not allow the motor to run because it won't be passing power through. So what we're going to need to do is once the motor is running, we're going to open up the enclosure. And then we want to take a look. You can either look in these little holes to see your rollers going around, or if you want to, you can lift up the pump head and see which way the rollers are turning. The rollers need to be turning counterclockwise because this is our input side and this is our output. So the pump is rotating in a counterclockwise direction. If it's rotating counterclockwise, then we know everything is wired correctly. If it is rotating clockwise, then we need to go to the power supply and reverse the wires. We need to switch the positive and ground around to make sure that we've got the polarity correct. So if we find out that the LED on the control is not turning on, or when you bypass the controller, the pump is running backwards, we have to start looking at troubleshooting the wiring and in turn the power supply. So generally speaking, when we look at tools to troubleshoot wiring, we've got two different options available that are most commonly found. One option is going to be what's referred to as a trouble light. So the trouble light isn't the best option that we have. We would much prefer you to use a tool like this, a multimeter. It doesn't necessarily have to be a digital multimeter, but a multimeter is going to give us the ability to find out what the voltage is. We can also see whether it's wired correctly or not. So let me just show you an example of why we don't prefer the trouble light for verifying whether things are wired correctly. So if we unplug the wire from the back of the controller and we've got the terminals here, the challenge is we can get inside these pins to see what we have for power, but we can't get into the ground. So a lot of times what will happen is we'll end up going to ground someplace else. So we'll end up using either a ground wire off of something else or say the frame of the tractor or chopper, and that's going to tell us that we have a good ground. And in this example, you'll see that we have power. So it shows that we have power on the hotline and we're grounded somewhere else. But this only tells us that we have power, because if we take this and plug it back into the control, we still don't have power. And the reason for that is it's a bad ground. So if we were to use our multimeter set to 12 volt DC, we can use these probes and we can put red to red and we can put black to black, and what I can see on the display is it's only showing millivolts. So in all reality, we don't have power going through. So what this indicates, since we had power on the positive line but not on the ground, is that we actually have a bad ground, which isn't going to be indicated with use of a trouble light because we're grounding someplace else. So we need to make certain that we're always testing both our positive and our ground wire when we're verifying system voltage and power. Now, another thing that I mentioned is that with the multimeter, we have the ability to see the polarity. So when we test this, if we go red to red and black to black, what you will see on the display now is that we have a negative number. So this is reading negative voltage, and what that means is that our power wire is actually hooked up to ground, and our ground wire is actually hooked up to power. So again, if it was wired this way and the pump was running backwards, that gives us an indicator of that. But because this is wired backwards, if we hook up the controller, which I will do right now, you'll see that we still don't have a functioning controller. The LED light doesn't come on because it's under reverse polarity protection. So we need to make sure that we're getting a positive reading on our multimeter using both our positive and ground leads or the pins within the wire harness. And then we also want to make sure that that voltage is ideally somewhere between 10 to 15 volts. Now, one thing I want to point out that we run into fairly often, and we take a fair amount of troubleshooting calls on this in the fall, is if you have your applicator hooked into the header switch of your chopper, we need to make sure that that header switch is actually allowing power to go through. So what happens sometimes in the fall is we will get calls from people and they say, hey, I'm chopping corn and my applicator is not working. Again, troubleshooting is questions and answers. So our response is when you had your pickup head on, did everything work fine? And more often than not, the answer to that is yes. Well, what that is telling us is more than likely there were high chopping. So we have the head set up here, and when you're with a pickup head, that head drops all the way to the ground. It's normally not elevated. So what happens is the switch point for the header switch on the chopper might be set here. So if that head stops above that and doesn't get down to that level, it won't turn power on to that port of the chopper. So we need to make sure wherever that head stop is, that the setting for that header switch to power the applicator on that machine is above or at that setting for the head. So then that way we activate it and turn power onto the applicator. So now that you have your motor running and we verified that the pump is rotating in the correct direction, if for some reason you find that it's still not pumping, just go back to the beginning of this video while we go through the troubleshooting steps for your pump will not pump. We hope you found this video useful, and if you were having some challenges that you were able to go through the steps and fix whatever may have been the challenge for you. Rest assured, if you do have any additional questions, you're always welcome to give our team a call at 320-252-8999. We're always happy to help, but keep in mind we do have regular business hours and we may not be quite as hardworking late at night or on the weekends as you are. So that's why we're putting this video out. If you need the help and we're not available, hopefully this has been helpful for you. If you have any questions or comments on this, just feel free to leave them below and we'll do our best to get back to you. Or again, anytime you need, feel free to reach out to us by phone, by email, or just leave us a comment. Thank you.